The waste truck backs up to the fence line at 6 in the morning, and neighbors watching from their porches figure Walt Pruitt's dairy plant is dumping their runoff again, same as they've done for years. Except this time, a lanky man in mud-caked boots is standing right there in the field, arms crossed, not stopping them, not yelling, he's just watching, writing something down in a notebook. Nobody in Caldwell County can figure out why a man would stand there and let his own land get poisoned without lifting a finger. That man is Dale Herrin, and what he's writing down that morning is going to turn 31 acres of ruined pasture land into a business that clears 7 figures a year. But before we get to that, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because you're going to want to see how this story ends. Caldwell County isn't the kind of place people go looking for. It's the kind of place people are from. Rolling hills cut up by fence lines, a grain co-op that doubles as the social hub, and one traffic light in the whole township. For 3 generations, the Herrin family ran cattle on that land until the milk prices collapsed, and Dale's father sold off the herd, keeping just the acreage and the debt. Dale grew up quiet, the kind of kid who didn't say much at the feed store, who other farmers forgot was even in the room. He wasn't the one anybody expected to do anything remarkable. He just showed up, did the work, and went home. Then the dairy processing plant 2 miles up the road expanded, and their wastewater lagoon started backing up. Instead of paying to haul it off properly, someone made the call to run an overflow line straight onto the low end of Dale's property. Nitrogen-heavy sludge, laced with cleaning chemicals from the plant floor, soaking into ground that used to grow decent hay. By the time Dale noticed the fish kill in his creek, and the dead patches spreading through his bottomland, the damage had already been done for months. Here's the part that surprises people. Dale didn't call a lawyer first. He called Emmett Voss. Emmett was 78 years old, a retired soil scientist who'd spent 40 years doing reclamation work for coal companies before he retired to a falling-down farmhouse outside town. Most folks thought he was just an odd old man who talked to his compost pile. Dale had done some fencing work for him 2 summers back, and remembered something Emmett said once. Almost as a joke, dirt doesn't die, it just changes hands. Dale showed up at Emmett's porch with a mason jar of black sludge from his creek bed and asked him straight out if the land was finished. Emmett didn't answer right away. He unscrewed the jar, smelled it, and said something Dale would repeat in interviews years later. Poison's not the end of the story, son. Poison's just a problem looking for the right organism to eat it. That's when Dale first heard the word mycoremediation. Now, before you scroll past thinking this is some magic dirt trick, understand this is real science. Certain fungi, oyster mushrooms in particular, produce enzymes that break down complex pollutants that most living things can't touch. Loggers and researchers have used oyster mushroom mycelium to filter diesel spills out of soil. Emmett had read the research papers for years, but never had land bad enough or desperate enough to actually try it at scale. Dale had both. So here's where the real story starts, and it's not glamorous. Emmett taught Dale how to build what's called a mycofiltration berm, essentially a wall of straw and wood chips inoculated with oyster mushroom spawn laid across the path the contaminated runoff had to cross. The fungal network, called mycelium, would grow through that material and physically trap and digest heavy compounds as water passed through it. It took 11 berms across the worst of the property, hand-built, 1 wheelbarrow load at a time, through a January that dropped to 9 degrees some nights. By March, the first test strip Emmett sent to a lab in Lexington came back, showing a 43% drop in contaminant load in the soil beneath the first berm. That's not nothing, but it's not a business either. Dale had 30 acres of bad land, and a stack of grow trials that weren't paying his mortgage. That's where the pattern interrupt in this story actually happens, because most people would have stopped at cleanup. Dale didn't. Standing in that field looking at the fungal blooms pushing up through the wood chips, oyster mushrooms fruiting right there on the reclamation berms themselves, he asked Emmett the question that changed everything. If the mushrooms are eating the poison, is anything they're eating ending up in the mushroom itself? Turns out that's the exact question the lab needed to test, and the answer mattered more than anyone expected. Oyster mushrooms grown specifically for remediation on the berms actively pulling toxins out of the ground, weren't safe to eat, and testing confirmed contaminant traces in the fruiting bodies exactly like Emmett suspected. But Dale had also started a second set of mushroom logs, upslope, on ground that had already been cleaned by the first round of berms. Those came back completely clean, which meant Dale wasn't just cleaning his land. He was building a two-stage system: dirty ground doing the dirty work, clean ground doing the growing. That's the kind of insight you don't get from a textbook. You get it from a man who refused to accept the first answer as the final one. By that summer, Dale had 400 oyster mushroom logs producing on reclaimed ground, selling to 2 restaurants in the county seat for $11 a pound. It wasn't 7 figures. It was barely enough to cover the diesel for his truck. His uncle told him at a family cookout that he was wasting his father's land on a science experiment, and half the county agreed with him. That uncle, by the way, is important because he's the skeptic in this story, and skeptics matter because they're the ones who eventually have to eat their words. The real turning point came 18 months in, when a state agricultural extension officer touring reclamation sites in the region heard about what Dale was doing and brought a photographer. The story that ran wasn't really about mushrooms. It was about a farmer who turned an environmental disaster into a working system without a single lawsuit or a single dollar of settlement money. That article got picked up by a regional paper, then a farming trade publication, and suddenly Dale was fielding calls from other landowners across 3 states dealing with contamination of their own, wanting to know if what he'd built could work on their ground too. Here's where the business really took shape, and it's not the part people expect. Dale didn't just keep growing mushrooms. He started selling the system itself, consulting with landowners on berm design, sourcing inoculated spawn in bulk from a lab partnership he built with, of all people, Emmett's old contacts from his coal reclamation days. Within 3 years, Dale Herrin Reclamation Farms was running remediation contracts on contaminated sites in 4 counties, selling gourmet mushrooms grown on the clean side of every property, and licensing the berm design to 2 other growers. The dairy plant that dumped the waste in the first place, the same company whose truck Dale watched back up to his fence line that morning, ended up hiring him 2 years later to remediate a separate lagoon overflow on a different piece of land they owned. Dale took the contract. He said in one interview it wasn't about revenge. It was about proving the ground could always come back if somebody was patient enough and stubborn enough to learn how. Last year, Dale Herrin Reclamation Farms crossed $1.4 million in combined revenue between remediation contracts and mushroom sales on land that 8 years earlier had a dead creek and a soil test nobody wanted to look at twice. Emmett Voss, well into his 80s now, still walks the property every week, and Dale still calls him before making any big decision on new ground. And that uncle who called it a waste of good land at the family cookout, he works there now, running the wood chip operation that feeds every new berm they build. What gets me about this story isn't the money, and it honestly isn't even the mushrooms. It's that everyone in that county looked at poisoned ground and saw an ending. Dale looked at it and saw a question nobody had bothered to ask yet. The land wasn't ruined. It was just waiting on somebody willing to listen to what an old man on a porch already knew, that nothing in nature is really finished. It's just changing hands. If this story hit you the way it hit me, tell me in the comments what you think Dale's father would say if he could see that farm today. And if you want more stories about people who turned the worst thing that ever happened to them into something nobody saw coming, subscribe, because we've got a lot more of these coming your way.